Pompey managed to slip out of Brundisium despite Caesar's siege and ferried his local troops across the Adriatic to Greece. Caesar wouldn't give chase. Pompey had taken all of the available ships with him, so Caesar ordered the authorities in Italy and Gaul, along with any remaining allied shipowners, to start gathering a fleet at Brundisium. Until enough ships were assembled, there was no point in staying put. Pompey and his allies were using the time to raise new armies in the provinces. Before heading east in pursuit, Caesar decided to secure his western flank. He marched to Spain to deal with the legions there, which still supported Pompey. Under the command of Marcius Petreius, Lucius Afranius, and Varro, Pompey had 7 legions stationed in Spain, over 40,000 infantry, and more than 5,000 cavalry, not including auxiliary forces. It was a serious military threat that could endanger Caesar's hold on Gaul and even threaten the safety of Italy itself. He couldn't afford to leave it unchecked while chasing Pompey. From Brundisium, Caesar headed to Rome. Up until then, he had avoided entering the capital to preserve his proconsular authority. But with his hopes for a quick victory and Pompey's capture fading, it was clear he had to prepare for a longer war. That meant raising new legions, and for that, he needed money. So Caesar, once again disregarding the laws of the Republic, entered the city. He took control of the state treasury and seized wealth from several temples. For now, the financial problem was solved. To avoid a grain shortage in Rome, he also needed to secure the provinces that supplied most of the Republic's grain, many of which were controlled by Pompey's supporters. Caesar sent his legate, Quintus Valerius Orca, with 1 legion to take Sardinia, and Gaius Curio with 3 legions to seize Sicily. At the time, Sardinia was governed by the Pompeian Marcus Aurelius Cotta, while Sicily was under the control of Cato the Younger. After taking Sicily, Curio was ordered to move on to Africa, which was held by another Pompeian, Attius Verus. Caesar also sent Gaius Antonius to Illyricum to control the mountain passes, both to prevent Pompey's forces from returning to Italy by land and to keep the routes open for Caesar's own advance. Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus were left in Italy to maintain order. Naval command was given to Publius Dolabella, who was tasked with building a fleet and wresting control of the Adriatic Sea from Pompey's forces. Once all of his orders were given, Caesar set out with 2 newly formed legions to join the 7 he had left behind in Gaul, and from there continued on towards Spain. But in Narbonese, Gaul, where his troops were assembling, he ran into an unexpected problem: the wealthy and strategically important city of Massilia. The city's leaders refused to let him in. They had stockpiled supplies from the surrounding countryside, called in support from the local tribe, the Albici, and set up workshops to produce weapons, and began reinforcing those city walls and their fleet. During negotiations, the city elders told Caesar they had planned to remain neutral in the conflict between him and Pompey. While these talks were still underway, Lucius Domitius Arenobarbus, whom Caesar had previously spared at Corfinium, arrived by sea. He convinced the Massilians to throw their support behind Pompey. They appointed him commander of the city, and he immediately ramped up preparations for a siege. At that point, Caesar couldn't risk leaving Massilia behind him. Doing so would have threatened his supply lines and connection to both Gaul and Italy. So he gave the order to prepare for a full-scale siege. While preparations for the siege were still underway, Caesar, not wanting to lose time, sent his legate Fabius ahead with 3 legions to secure the mountain passes through the Pyrenees. Another 3 legions stationed a bit farther north in Gaul were expected to join him soon. About a month into the siege of Massilia, Caesar decided it was time to move on to Spain. He left 3 legions behind under the command of Decimus Brutus and Gaius Trebonius to continue the siege, and set off himself with just his personal guard and a unit of Gallic cavalry. Pompey's forces in Spain were significant. The south of the peninsula was controlled by Varro, who commanded 2 legions. Marcus Petreius held the west with 2 legions, while Lucius Afranius was in the north with 3. All of these troops were loyal to Pompey, experienced, battle-hardened veterans with years of fighting barbarian tribes behind them. When they heard Caesar was approaching, Petreius and Afranius decided to combine their forces and set up camp near the city of Ilerda. The location allowed them to control a key crossing over the Segre River, where there was only a single stone bridge. They established their main camp on a high hill south of the city, leaving just a few cohorts in Ilerda to guard the bridge. Together, Pompey's forces at Ilerda numbered around 70,000 men, 5 full legions, 5,000 cavalry, and 80 auxiliary cohorts. As they prepared for Caesar's arrival, they began collecting supplies from the surrounding countryside and stockpiling them in the city. They quickly stripped the western bank of the Segre clean, then moved across to the eastern bank to do the same. Meanwhile, Fabius had successfully carried out Caesar's orders. His troops drove Afranius' forces out of the Pyrenean passes. By mid-May of 49 BC, Fabius arrived near Ilerda with 40,000 men, 6 full legions, 3,000 cavalry, and 20 cohorts of auxiliaries. He ordered wooden bridges to be built across the Segre River north of the city, allowing his army to come across the western bank without resistance. But the western side had already been stripped of supplies by Afranius' troops, and Fabius had brought provisions for only a few days. To resupply, he began sending foraging parties across the river to the eastern bank. There, they frequently ran into Pompeian foragers and clashes broke out. The Pompeians usually had the upper hand thanks to their larger cavalry force, so Fabius started sending more and more troops to protect his men. During one of these missions, 2 legions were sent across the river to gather supplies. Suddenly, a violent storm hit, and the wooden bridge they had used collapsed. Afranius, seeing the wreckage, quickly realized the 2 legions were cut off. He seized the moment and sent 4 legions, backed by his entire cavalry force, to intercept and destroy them before they could reconnect with the rest of Fabius' army. The Caesarian detachment was led by legate Lucius Plancus. When he spotted the approaching enemy, he quickly ordered his men to march to the nearest hill and form a circular defensive line. Though outnumbered, the Caesarians held their ground thanks to the strong position. Meanwhile, Fabius, learning that the bridge had collapsed, correctly guessed Afranius' plan and immediately sent 2 more legions across the northern bridge to support Plancus. The reinforcements reached the hill in time, forcing Afranius to pull back and avoid a costly engagement. With the immediate danger past, the Caesarians quickly rebuilt the destroyed bridge. 2 days later, Caesar himself arrived at Ilerda, bringing not only his personal guard, but 1,000 Gallic cavalry. He wasted no time and moved straight into action. Leaving a few cohorts behind to guard the baggage train, he led his troops out of camp and formed them up in battle order opposite the Pompeian lines. Afranius accepted the challenge and brought out his own army, but chose not to attack. He held a strong position on a hillside and hoped Caesar would make the first move, forcing his troops to fight uphill, a risky and costly maneuver. But Caesar saw through the tactic and held his ground. Instead, he arranged his army in the standard 3 lines. The first 2 stayed in formation, while the third, on his orders, began digging a trench, laying the groundwork for a new forward camp. Afranius mistook Caesar's caution for hesitation, giving Caesar just enough time to carry out his plan. His troops dug a wide trench without being noticed, and that night, instead of returning to camp, Caesar had them stay behind the newly dug defenses. The next day, the construction continued, this time in plain sight. Afranius realized too late what was happening and couldn't stop the work. Once the new camp was finished, Caesar moved his baggage train in. Now, the 2 armies were camped just a short distance apart, face to face. Afranius pulled his troops back to camp and chose to avoid a direct fight. That suited him just fine. Time was working in his favor. Caesar, by contrast, was running low on supplies, while Afranius had large stockpiles stored in Ilerda. To break the stalemate, Caesar has set his sights on a small hill between Afranius' camp and the city. If he could take it, he could cut off Afranius' access to his supply route. Caesar sent 3 legions to take the hill. He dispatched an advanced guard to begin the assault while leading the rest of the troops out of camp. But Afranius quickly caught on to Caesar's plan. He ordered a rapid march, sending cohorts to secure the hill before Caesar's men could get there. Being closer, the Pompeians reached it first and took up defensive positions. Afranius then reinforced the hill with more troops. The Pompeians fought using tactics unfamiliar to Roman legionaries. Instead of holding a tight formation, they attacked in small, fast-moving groups and retreated quickly when pressured, a style borrowed from the Iberian tribes. The unorthodox tactics threw Caesar's men off balance, and their formation began to fall apart. Under a hail of pila and arrows, the Caesarian soldiers started to waver and slowly fall back. Seeing the danger, Caesar sent in the 9th Legion. With a powerful charge, they not only steadied the line but managed to push the Pompeians off of the hill. Afranius' troops, under pressure from the 9th Legion, fell back towards Ilerda. Thinking the enemy was in full retreat and that victory was at hand, Caesar's legionaries gave chase. But as the Pompeians reached the city walls, Caesar's men were suddenly hit by a hail of javelins, arrows, and pila from the battlements. The terrain was too tight for cavalry to maneuver, leaving the 9th Legion without any support. The fighting beneath the walls was brutal and lasted for 5 hours. The Pompeians held the high ground and had the added advantage of missile fire from inside the city. Partway through the battle, Caesar's troops ran out of projectiles, but even so, they managed to push the enemy back to the gates and drive them inside the city. That opened up enough space for the cavalry to move in and cover the retreat of the exhausted 9th Legion. In his commentaries on the Civil War, Caesar described the battle as a victory, but in reality it was a setback. He failed to take the key hill that he had originally targeted. While fighting raged near the city, Afranius' forces moved in quietly and reclaimed it. Caesar's first clash at Ilerda had ended in defeat, and his situation began to unravel. By June, the mountain snow was melting rapidly, turning the rivers into fast-moving, swollen torrents. Heavy rains and storms followed, and after one particularly violent downpour, the Segre River flooded its banks. Both of the wooden bridges that Caesar's troops had built were swept away, leaving his entire army stranded on the western bank. Until a new crossing could be built, there was no way to bring in reinforcements from Italy. Supplies were running dangerously low, and there was nothing left to forage. Local resources had already been picked clean. Afranius, meanwhile, still had access to the stone bridge and vast reserves of provisions stored in Ilerda. Every time Caesar tried to rebuild the bridges, his engineers were immediately driven off by Afranius' archers and spearmen positioned on the opposite bank. Caesar was waiting on a large supply convoy and reinforcements, but with no way across the river, he couldn't reach them. Afranius' scouts spotted the convoy and alerted him. He quickly sent cavalry to intercept it, but the escort, 5,000 Gallic horsemen, managed to beat them back. Realizing they wouldn't be able to link up with Caesar, the Gallic cavalry withdrew into the nearby mountains and set up camp. Afranius sent 3 legions to dislodge them, but after getting a close look at the camp's defenses, he decided against an attack and hurried back to his own camp. The Gauls lost about 300 cavalrymen in the clash. Afranius' losses are unknown, but they were likely very heavy. His cavalry took no further action after the battle, suggesting they'd been badly weakened. Still, despite the tactical defeat, Afranius had won a strategic victory. He'd successfully cut off Caesar's supplies and left his army facing the threat of starvation. But within a few days, Caesar found a way out of what looked like a hopeless situation. He ordered the construction of coracles, small boats made from branches and animal hides. One night, a legion quietly set out north, transporting the lightweight boats on wagons. Caesar's plan was to slip past Afranius' scouts, ferry the legion across the river, build a fortified position on the far bank, and then construct a bridge under its protection. The legion marched more than 20 kilometers upstream during the night, crossed the Segre, and began building both defenses and the bridge. The plan worked. Within 2 days, Caesar had a new crossing. The supply convoy crossed the river immediately and, under the protection of Gallic cavalry, made its way safely to Caesar's camp. With the bridge restored, Caesar not only secured food for his army, but also regained access to the eastern bank for foraging. And best of all, it all happened under the enemy's nose. Caesar's cavalry began launching surprise raids on Afranius' foraging parties, catching them completely off guard. With his own cavalry weakened from the earlier failed ambush on the convoy, Afranius had no real way to strike back. His ability to gather supplies was now severely limited, and the balance of the campaign had started to shift in Caesar's favor. Afranius was now forced to send out entire legions just to gather forage. But that wasn't even enough. At the same time, local tribes, seeing the tide turning and recognizing Caesar as the likely victor, began to shift their loyalties. They sent envoys to Caesar and agreed to supply his army with food. Caesar's Gallic cavalry was highly effective at disrupting Afranius' foraging efforts. But with the only bridge so far upstream, they couldn't always respond quickly to movements on the opposite bank. To fix this, Caesar came up with a clever solution. He would divert part of the river to lower the water level, allowing his cavalry to ford it more easily. A suitable spot was found a few kilometers north of Ilerda. Legionaries got to work digging trenches to redirect the river. By the time Afranius realized what was happening, the work was nearly done, and he was too late to stop it. At a war council, Afranius and Petreius decided to abandon their position near Ilerda and head south to join forces with Varro in southern Spain. There, they hoped to rally support from local tribes and cities still loyal to Pompey. By using the terrain to their advantage and counting on help from the local population, they aimed to prolong the campaign in Spain until winter, buying valuable time for Pompey to regroup and raise more troops in Greece. To put their plan into action, Afranius and Petreius reached out to Varro, instructing him to build a pontoon bridge over the Ebro River near Octagessa. Meanwhile, they began preparing to withdraw. Petreius sent 2 legions to the eastern bank of the Segre to construct fortifications that would cover the army's crossing at the stone bridge. Caesar got wind of their plan through scouts and deserters. At the time, he couldn't stop Afranius and Petreius from escaping. The effort to lower the water level on the Segre was still unfinished. The river was shallow enough for cavalry to ford, but still too deep for infantry. Soon after, Afranius received word that the Ebro crossing was ready. That same night, the Pompeian army broke camp and set off. The legionaries carried just enough provisions for the march, leaving the rest behind in Ilerda. Petreius left a few cohorts to garrison the city. Caesar responded immediately, sending his cavalry in pursuit. The horsemen harassed the stretched-out Pompeian column, firing arrows and throwing pila from a safe distance, avoiding close combat. These skirmishes didn't cause major casualties, but they kept the enemy on edge and slowed their progress. That was the goal. The cavalry's job wasn't to destroy the column, but to delay it long enough for Caesar's main force to catch up. The cavalry had done their job. By dawn of the next day, the rear of Afranius' column was still visible from the western bank of the Segre, where Caesar's main force was camped. By then, the river had dropped enough so that at its deepest point, the water only came up to a man's chest. Eager to continue the chase, Caesar's legionaries began pleading with him to let them cross. Eventually, he gave the order. He instructed that the wounded and unfit remain in camp, while the rest of the army prepared to ford the river. To make the crossing safer, Caesar stationed horses both upstream and downstream. Those upstream would break the current, while those downstream would help catch any men who lost their footing. With these precautions in place, the infantry crossed the Segre without losses or difficulty. Moving at a forced march, Caesar's legions quickly caught up to Afranius' column. Afranius hurriedly drew his troops for battle, but Caesar chose not to attack. He let his men rest after a grueling day of marching, river crossing, and digging. Scouts from both sides reported that the only passable route south was a narrow defile. Whoever reached it first would control the way forward. Even a small force could block it effectively. For Afranius, it was a path to safety. For Caesar, it was a chance to trap his opponent and prevent the Pompeian forces in Spain from linking up. As the day came to an end, Afranius allowed his troops to rest after a long, exhausting march under constant harassment. He also knew that Caesar's cavalry would make it nearly impossible to reach the mountain pass quickly. But Caesar had a plan to outmaneuver him. The next morning, the Pompeians watched as Caesar's troops packed up and began marching back towards Ilerda. They assumed he was retreating due to a shortage of supplies. But that was exactly what Caesar wanted them to think. In reality, he intended to reach the pass first. But since the main road was blocked by Afranius' army, he led his legions on a tough detour over rough terrain and steep hills. Before long, Afranius' scouts realized what was happening. Despite the difficult route, Caesar's forces made good time and soon drew level with the Pompeian camp. Afranius quickly broke camp and rushed his troops toward the pass, but Caesar's cavalry kept up the pressure, launching hit-and-run attacks, forcing the column to halt and defend itself again and again. The constant delays gave Caesar just enough time to get ahead and block the road south. With the main route to the Ebro now cut off, Afranius made one last attempt to escape. He sent a detachment of auxiliaries to secure high ground overlooking a mountain trail, hoping his army could slip through under their cover. But Caesar's cavalry struck before they could gain any ground, driving them back and closing off the final route to safety. The situation was perfect for a decisive confrontation. The Pompeian army was exposed in open ground, the morale was low, while Caesar's troops were confident and eager for victory. But Caesar had no desire for a bloody battle. He'd hoped to win through pressure and maneuver, not slaughter. He positioned his forces in the narrow mountain pass, intentionally leaving Afranius away back to the camp they had left that morning. Afranius and Petreius convened a war council. They had only two options left: either retreat to Ilerda, where food and supplies were stored, or attempt a march to Terrico. But supply problems were already taking their toll. The Pompeians were nearly out of food, and they had no access to water. Units sent to the river were repeatedly driven off by Caesar's cavalry, which hovered constantly nearby. In response, Afranius and Petreius placed guards along the route of the river and began building a protective rampart, overseeing the work themselves. While the commanders were away, something unexpected happened. Soldiers from both sides began chatting, and then openly fraternizing. What started as casual conversations between common legionaries soon extended to centurions and even military tribunes. Pompeian troops quietly asked about the possibility of surrender and whether they'd be guaranteed safety. For a moment, it seemed the war in Spain might end without another fight. But when Petreius returned and saw what was happening, he quickly took control. He drove Caesar's men away from the camp and called a full assembly, where he forced every soldier to renew their oath of loyalty to Pompey, abruptly ending the brief chance for peace. The deadlock lasted for several days. Neither side made a move. Every time the Pompeians tried to forage, Caesar's cavalry was on them immediately, breaking up their efforts. Water was scarce, but it was the food situation that was truly dire. The legionaries had packed just enough rations for their march to Octogessa, while the auxiliaries had only 2 or 3 days' worth, and those had long since run out. Hunger was setting in across the army, and many auxiliaries began deserting to Caesar, whose camp was well stocked with supplies. Fearing a total collapse, Afranius and Petreius decided to retreat to Ilerda, where food stores still remained and a defensive position could be held. They broke camp and set out, but Caesar responded immediately, sending his cavalry in pursuit. Just like before, his horsemen constantly harassed the column, slowing their march and giving them no time to regroup. Afranius never made it back. The continuous cavalry attacks and Caesar's legions following close behind left him with no chance to gain ground or find a strong position. Eventually, the Pompeians managed to set up camp, but it was in a poor spot, exposed in the open and far from the river. Sensing his advantage, Caesar ordered his men begin digging trenches around the camp, aiming to completely cut the Pompeians off from resupply. In a final effort to stop the encirclement, Afranius brought his army out and formed up for battle. Caesar did the same, but once again, no fighting followed. Caesar still hoped to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. He knew Afranius' army was worn down and close to surrender. Afranius, by then, had given up any real hope of turning the situation around. Surrounded and cut off from all supplies, Afranius and Petreius finally agreed to negotiate a truce. At first, they had tried to strike a private deal with Caesar, but instead, he decided that the talks would be held openly. With no other option, they agreed, and the next day, the Pompeian army surrendered. Caesar disbanded their legions, but welcomed any soldiers who wished to join his ranks. In the end, he had defeated a larger enemy force quickly and with minimal bloodshed. The surrender at Ilerda effectively decided the fate of southern Spain as well. Varro, who commanded just 2 legions and a few auxiliary units, found himself increasingly isolated. As the news of Afranius' capitulation spread, cities that had been loyal to Pompey began switching sides. One of Varro's legions defected in full. In key cities, locals expelled Pompeian garrisons, closed their gates to Varro's forces, and refused to provide supplies. Even Gades, where Varro had gathered ships, food, and a large treasury, declared for Caesar. With support collapsing around him, Varro had no choice but to seek peace. Caesar then toured the major cities of Spain: Gades, Narbo, Corduba, Terrico, and others. He appointed Quintus Cassius Longinus as the governor of southern Spain and began his return journey to Italy. His path would take him through the still besieged city of Massilia. Once again, if you've made it to the end of this video, we really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. We have a whole team behind this, and we really love seeing you follow along on our journey through ancient civilizations. We put out new content every single week. If you'd like to support the channel and help us make more videos like this, consider joining us on Patreon. You'll get early access to new episodes, work in progress updates, and more. Every bit of support goes a really long way. Thank you. You can also leave a super thanks down below if you'd like to give us a little extra boost. It really means a lot and helps us keep going. We hope to see you next time.